What if the story you thought you knew was only the polished, Instagram-filtered version? What if the silence wasn't strength but survival? And what if the words "I can't pretend anymore" weren't a catchphrase, but a warning? Tonight, we're pulling back the velvet curtain on a story that reality TV fans swear they've already figured out, but trust me, this version hits different. Because when Kenya Moore finally breaks her silence about Marc Daly, it's not with tears and violins. It's with receipts, side eyes, and that unmistakable tone that says, "You played in my face. And now I'm done." Now before the lawyers hyperventilate, deep breath, this is satirical commentary, allegedly, hypothetically, spiritually inspired by pop culture chaos. But still, why does it feel so close to the bone? Why are insiders suddenly anonymous, phones suddenly leaking, and timelines suddenly not adding up? Coincidence? Or just another Tuesday in reality TV land? Because this isn't just a divorce story. This is a rebrand, a reckoning, and possibly the most dramatic tell nothing but say everything moment we've seen in years. So buckle up. Ask yourself who's lying, who's quiet, and who's about to trend for all the wrong reasons, because once the pretending stops, everybody gets exposed. Everybody thinks they know how the story starts. A marriage collapses, a divorce is filed, and the internet fills in the blanks with memes, timelines, and hot takes. Simple, right? Except nothing about this situation has ever been simple, and Kenya Moore knows that better than anyone. Because behind the glossy red carpet smiles and perfectly rehearsed confessionals, there was a version of events that never made it to camera, never made it into official statements, and definitely never made it into the carefully worded press blurbs that fans were fed for years. And now, in this moment where she says she can't pretend anymore, the story rewinds to the very beginning. To a marriage that looked solid on paper, but felt shaky behind closed doors almost from day one. Let's be clear, at least in this version of reality that lives somewhere between rumor, satire, and pop culture folklore. Kenya Moore, longtime reality TV lightning rod, and Marc Daly, the businessman who always seemed just a little uncomfortable under the spotlight, were never supposed to be boring. From the moment they appeared together, viewers sensed friction. Not the cute, opposites attract kind, but the tense, smile through your teeth kind. Fans noticed how Marc stayed distant from the cameras, how explanations never quite lined up, how entire chapters of their relationship seemed to happen off-screen. And whenever questions came up, the answer was always the same: privacy, protection, boundaries. Reasonable words. Convenient words, but in the world of reality television, privacy doesn't erase suspicion, it multiplies it. Old clips resurfaced. Awkward moments were replayed in slow motion. Comments that once seemed harmless suddenly felt loaded. And slowly, quietly, the narrative began to shift, not because of one explosive incident, but because of a pattern. A pattern of absence. A pattern of deflection. A pattern of Kenya defending a marriage that, according to Whisper networks and anonymous fan accounts, was already under strain long before the public ever noticed. In this satirical retelling, the cracks didn't come from one fight or one betrayal, but from a long, exhausting performance. Kenya playing the role of the loyal wife, the protective mother, the woman insisting everything was fine while clearly carrying the emotional weight of someone holding a secret too heavy to name. Viewers joked about it online, critics mocked her loyalty, and yet she kept going. Because sometimes pretending isn't about fooling others. Sometimes it's about buying time. Then comes the part everyone argues about. The rumors, the alleged overlaps, the names that should never have been spoken in the same sentence suddenly being whispered together by blogs that live for chaos. In this exaggerated, investigative commentary universe, speculation began circulating that Marc's life wasn't as neatly divided as it appeared. That his schedule, his business trips, his unexplained disappearances didn't quite align with the official story. And when one name kept popping up in the rumor mill, fans didn't know whether to laugh it off or lean in closer. Because that name carried weight, history, and its own complicated reputation within the same reality TV ecosystem. Again, Allegedly, hypothetically, in the way that internet rumors are born at 2 in the morning and spread by breakfast. But once an idea is planted, it's hard to unsee. Every interaction gets reanalyzed. Every old photo becomes evidence. Every friendly gesture gets reframed as something more. And while the public turned speculation into sport, Kenya stayed silent. No dramatic tweets. No cryptic captions. Just distance. And silence, in this genre, is never empty. What people forget is that silence can be strategic. According to this narrative, Kenya wasn't quiet because she didn't know. She was quiet because she knew too much. Because when you have a child involved, when your life is being documented and dissected, sometimes the safest move is to say nothing and let everyone underestimate how much you see. That's the part the audience doesn't always understand. They see confidence and assume invincibility. They see beauty and assume control. But control is often the first thing to go when trust starts eroding behind the scenes, or at least in the dramatic retelling that fuels commentary channels and late-night discussions. Kenya was allegedly piecing together a puzzle made of half-truths, stories that didn't match timelines, explanations that changed depending on who was asking, a growing sense that the marriage she was defending publicly wasn't the same marriage she was living privately. And every time she questioned it, the response was dismissal. You're overthinking. You're imagining things. You're reacting because of your past. Classic deflection, according to every armchair psychologist on the internet. What makes this scandal so sticky, so endlessly discussable, isn't just the idea of betrayal, it's the idea of gaslighting. The notion that Kenya wasn't just hurt, but slowly convinced that her instincts were the problem, that her questions were flaws, that her need for clarity was insecurity. In this version of events, that emotional erosion did more damage than any single rumor ever could. Because once you start doubting your own reality, the performance becomes exhausting. Publicly, the marriage limped on. Smiles appeared when required. Statements were issued when necessary. And the audience, always hungry for drama, waited for the moment something would finally crack. And then it did. Not all at once. Not in a screaming match or a viral video, but in a shift, a tone change. Kenya stopped explaining. Stop defending. Stop trying to convince anyone that things were normal. And when the divorce finally became official, people rushed to assign blame without realizing they were late to the story. In the satirical investigative lens, the divorce wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the truth phase. The moment when pretending no longer served a purpose. When protecting someone else's image came at too high a cost to her own sanity. And while the public focused on legal filings and custody arrangements, the real fallout was internal. Years of swallowed words. Years of rationalizing behavior that never quite sat right. Years of choosing peace on the outside while chaos brewed within. As this part of the story closes, one thing becomes clear. Whatever you believe, whatever version you subscribe to, this wasn't a sudden decision. It was a slow burn, a long exit plan, a woman reaching the limit of how much silence she could carry without losing herself entirely. And just as the audience thinks they've reached the full picture, just as they assume the worst is already known, the narrative doesn't pause. It leans forward. Because the next phase isn't about what allegedly happened behind closed doors. It's about what happens when whispers turn into reactions, when private pain becomes public conversation, and when the fallout spreads far beyond a single marriage and into a full-blown media storm that nobody involved can fully control. And that's exactly where the story continues next, without stopping, without resetting, and without giving anyone a chance to catch their breath. The moment the narrative spilled out of the marriage and into the public arena, everything changed. Suddenly, it wasn't just about what may or may not have happened behind closed doors, but about how people reacted once the door was cracked open. Blogs lit up overnight. Commentary channels sharpened their thumbnails. Anonymous insiders appeared out of nowhere, each claiming they had always known something was off. And in this exaggerated investigative universe, The story took on a life of its own, mutating with every retelling, growing louder and messier by the hour, according to these so-called sources. Once the separation became inevitable, information started flowing in ways it never had before. Messages allegedly surfaced, screenshots supposedly circulated in private group chats. Timelines were stitched together by people who had never met the couple but felt oddly invested in proving a theory. And at the center of it all was the idea that Marc's life had been carefully compartmentalized, with different versions of himself presented to different people, depending on what suited him at the time. Husband here, businessman there, charming confidant somewhere else entirely. Charming confidant somewhere else entirely. In this dramatized account, the rumors weren't subtle. They were extravagant. Lavish dinners that were just meetings, hotel stays that were purely business, credit card charges that didn't quite align with official explanations. Every detail, no matter how small, became fuel. Commentators spoke with mock seriousness, lowering their voices as if revealing classified documents, insisting that what the public saw was only the surface. Beneath it, they claimed, was a web of financial decisions, secret understandings, and carefully managed appearances. And then came the alleged witnesses, friends of friends, former employees, people who insisted they had seen things they couldn't unsee in this version of the story. One anonymous source claimed that Kenya wasn't just emotionally blindsided, but financially sidelined, kept at arm's length from decisions that directly affected her household. Another source suggested that whenever she asked questions, she was told it was for her own good not to know. Protection, they called it. Control, the internet translated. Public reaction split instantly into camps. One side declared Kenya a victim who had been playing defense for years. The other accused her of rewriting history now that the marriage had failed. Memes flew back and forth. Old interviews were dissected frame by frame. Every pause, every laugh, every moment of tension was reinterpreted as proof of something sinister lurking beneath the surface. And through it all, Kenya's silence grew heavier, more deliberate. What really escalated the frenzy in this satirical retelling was the suggestion that powerful people were invested in keeping certain narratives quiet. Not because of love, but because of image, reputation, brand value. Suddenly, the divorce wasn't just personal. It was political in the reality TV sense of the word. Alliances mattered. Public statements were weighed carefully. Some people spoke up just enough to appear supportive without confirming anything. Others vanished completely, which only made the speculation louder. Commentators joked that this was no longer a breakup, it was a cover-up. Every denial was treated like confirmation. Every vague comment was treated like a confession in disguise. And when Kenya finally hinted, ever so slightly, that there was more to the story than people realized, the internet exploded. Not because she gave details, but because she didn't, because she let the implication hang in the air, daring people to sit with their discomfort. In this fictionalized investigative storm, leaked reports began circulating, documents that looked official enough to scare people, even if no one could verify where they came from. Claims of hidden assets, claims of parallel lives, claims that the marriage wasn't just strained but strategically managed for appearances. It didn't matter whether any of it was true. What mattered was that it felt believable enough to keep people watching. Meanwhile, Kenya's public image began to shift in real time. Where she had once been labeled dramatic or difficult, now she was being reframed as calculated, patient, and quietly resilient. People praised her for holding it together as long as she did. Others criticized her for not exposing everything sooner. The same behavior that once drew ridicule was suddenly being reinterpreted as restraint. It was a reminder of how quickly public opinion can flip when new context, real or imagined, enters the conversation. Marc, on the other hand, became a blank canvas for projection. His continued silence was read in every possible way. Guilt by omission, some said. Dignity, others argued. Strategic legal advice suggested the armchair experts who claimed to understand divorce law because they once watched a courtroom drama. Every move, or lack of one, was scrutinized until it barely resembled reality anymore. what added another layer of absurdity was how seriously everyone pretended to be taking this. You had commentators speaking as if they were uncovering a global conspiracy rather than gossip wrapped in speculation. Dramatic pauses, lowered voices, phrases like, "what they don't want you to know," and "follow the money" were thrown around with theatrical confidence. It was investigative theater, and the audience loved every second of it. And yet, beneath the sarcasm and exaggeration, there was something uncomfortably familiar about the story being told. The idea of a woman doubting herself because everyone around her insists she's overreacting. The idea of power being used subtly, not through shouting, but through minimization. The idea that by the time the truth comes out, people have already decided who they want to believe. That's why this narrative stuck. Not because of the names involved, but because of the pattern it mirrored. As reactions continued to pour in, the situation reached a point where ignoring it was no longer an option. Brands grew cautious. Appearances were reconsidered. People who once loved to be adjacent to the drama suddenly wanted plausible deniability. In this version of events, the fallout wasn't just emotional, it was professional. Quiet phone calls were made. Meetings were postponed. Everyone waited to see who would blink first, and still, Kenya didn't rush. That was the part that frustrated people the most. They wanted a tell-all, a tearful confession, a dramatic monologue spelling out every alleged betrayal. Instead, they got restraint, measured words, carefully chosen phrases that suggested depth without confirming details. It drove the internet wild, because nothing fuels speculation like the feeling that someone knows more than they're saying and is choosing, very deliberately, not to share it yet. By the end of this phase, the divorce had transformed into something much larger than a legal separation. It had become a cultural moment inflated by commentary and imagination until it barely resembled the regional relationship. And just when it seemed like the noise couldn't get any louder, when every angle had been debated and every rumor recycled, the story took another turn. Because the next chapter isn't about whispers or reactions. It's about consequences, about what happens when speculation collides with institutions, when private drama brushes up against public accountability, and when the question shifts from what really happened to who pays the price. And that's exactly where the story continues without pause, carrying all the tension straight into what comes next. By the time the conversation shifted from speculation to consequences, the atmosphere around the story felt heavier, sharper, almost official. In this exaggerated universe, people began talking less about feelings and more about outcomes. Not what went wrong, but what might happen next. Once a narrative grows large enough, it starts attracting institutions, or at least the idea of them. Suddenly, words like inquiry, review, and accountability began floating through commentary as if someone somewhere was preparing a clipboard. In this retelling, anonymous legal experts appeared on live streams, confidently explaining how things could unfold if even a fraction of the rumors were true. They spoke about custody dynamics, asset reviews, and reputational risk with the seriousness of people who had never met the individuals involved but felt fully qualified to map out their futures. Every hypothetical was framed as imminent. Every possibility was treated like a countdown. And the audience leaned in because nothing keeps people watching like the promise of consequences. The idea that this situation might ripple beyond a private divorce energized the commentary machine. People speculated about audits that might never happen, investigations that existed only as talking points, and financial reckonings described in dramatic language that made everything sound one press conference away from collapse. In this version of events, Marc's business dealings were suddenly under a microscope not because of evidence, but because suspicion thrives in a vacuum. When answers don't come, imagination fills the gap. Meanwhile, Kenya's role in the story subtly shifted again. No longer just the silent party or the wrong spouse, she was now framed as the potential catalyst. The person whose refusal to keep pretending could, in theory, trigger a domino effect. Commentators spoke about her like she was holding a button she hadn't pressed yet. The power of restraint became its own storyline. What would happen if she spoke freely? What if she didn't? Either way, people were already assigning impact to choices she hadn't publicly made. Public backlash in this dramatized telling became performative. Hashtags trended. Opinions hardened. Some fans demanded full transparency, insisting that silence was complicity. Others praised her for protecting her child from becoming collateral damage in a media spectacle. Every stance was moralized. Every comment section turned into a courtroom where strangers argued cases based on vibes and edited clips. The louder it got, the harder it became to remember that this all began with two people who couldn't make a marriage work. There was also the quiet fear that always follows these stories. The fear of cancellation, of association, of being on the wrong side of public sentiment. In this universe, people once eager to appear connected to Marc allegedly began distancing themselves. Invitations dried up. Partnerships grew vague. No announcements were made, but the absence spoke volumes. In contrast, Kenya's brand narrative shifted toward resilience, strength through silence, dignity through restraint. Whether intentional or accidental, the optics favored her. What made this phase especially surreal was how normalized the escalation became. Viewers talked about hypothetical court battles and financial repercussions the way they'd discuss a season finale. Speculation became entertainment. Entertainment became expectation. And expectation turned into entitlement. People felt owed an ending that matched the drama they'd invested in. They wanted a villain punished, a hero vindicated, a conclusion neat enough to clip and share. But real life, even in exaggerated retellings, rarely delivers clean resolutions. Instead, what emerged was ambiguity. Kenya didn't launch a scorched earth reveal. Marc didn't step forward with a grand rebuttal. No official body confirmed any investigation. The tension lingered, unresolved, and that uncertainty frustrated the audience more than any confirmation ever could. Because ambiguity doesn't satisfy, it provokes. In the background, the industry kept moving. Shows continued filming. New scandals competed for attention. Yet this story refused to disappear entirely. It lingered as a reference point, a cautionary tale commentators returned to whenever the topic of image versus reality came up. It became shorthand for the idea that not everything breaks loudly. Some things erode quietly until one person decides they're done carrying the weight. In this final stretch of the narrative, Kenya's statement, "I can't pretend anymore," echoed louder than any alleged receipt or leaked message. Not because it accused, but because it withdrew participation. Pretending is labor. Protecting is labor. Holding a story together for the sake of appearances is labor. And in this version of events, she simply opted out. That choice alone disrupted the entire ecosystem built around silence. What's left at the end isn't justice or vindication or even clarity. It's a question mark, a reminder of how quickly stories grow beyond the people at their center. How easily satire blends with speculation. How audiences confuse access with truth. And how sometimes the most radical act in a spectacle-driven world is to stop performing altogether. So the story closes not with a verdict, but with tension still humming beneath the surface. With people still arguing, still projecting, still waiting for something definitive that may never come. And maybe that's the real fallout. Not ruined reputations or imagined investigations, but the discomfort of realizing that the full truth, whatever it is, doesn't belong to the audience. It belongs to the people who lived it, and in this retelling, one of them finally chose herself over the narrative, leaving everyone else to sit with the noise they helped create. And now, the question is yours. After everything you've heard, after all the whispers, reactions, and carefully managed silence, who do you believe was really pretending and who was simply trying to survive the story being written about them? Was this a calculated performance that finally collapsed, or a long game of restraint that the public mistook for weakness? Because one thing is clear, when someone says they can't pretend anymore, there's no going back to the version of the story that felt comfortable. So tell me this. If you were in that position, would you protect the truth Or would you protect the peace? Would you speak and risk everything, or stay quiet and let the world decide for you? Drop your thoughts below because the comment section is where the real investigations happen. I want to know what you saw, what you felt, and what doesn't add up for you. If this story made you question the narratives we're fed, make sure you hit like so more people see it. Subscribe if you're tired of surface-level explanations and want the deeper, messier conversations that nobody else wants to touch. And turn on notifications because if this story evolves, if the silence breaks again, or if a new chapter opens, you'll want to be here when it happens.